Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Louisa Evers. She's the science coordinator with the Bureau of Land Management at the Oregon-Washington State Office, and she's located in Portland, Oregon. Her topic is going to be understanding climate adaptation strategies.
Hello, everyone. So in this presentation, I will introduce you to some of the observed changes in climate that are important to the sagebrush ecosystems, briefly discuss some general adaptive management principles, and then provide some adaptive strategies that are key to these systems. Lastly, I'll review some of the key climate change considerations and provide some potential responses to them. Note that in this presentation, when I refer to grazing, I mean grazing by both livestock and wild horses and burros, as they are a high influence, particularly in some areas. So this slide shows some of the observed changes in climate. The projections are that these changes will continue. The upshot is that our climate in the West is getting warmer and drier. We have less snow and more rain. We have reduced stream flow in summer, more rapid snow melt in late winter, early spring, increased drought, and increased area burned. The remainder of this presentation will cover some of the types of actions we could or should take to address some of these changes. So the science framework lays out 3 general adaptive concepts that are applicable across the sagebrush biome. The wording here is a little bit different than what's in the framework in order to emphasize the climate change aspects. Resistance actions are those that increase the ability of the existing plant communities to maintain their structure, function, and ecosystem processes. Resilience actions are those that reduce vulnerability to climate change and increase the adaptive capacity of key species or plant communities. And in response actions are those that facilitate the inevitable transitions that result from changing climates. Note that an individual action may fall into one of these categories or it may actually fall into more than one category. So here's some of the principles and strategies that integrate the concepts of resistance, resilience, response, and that we can apply as the climate changes. First, we need to think and plan at multiple scales. These changes will not occur evenly across the landscape or over time, so we need to take that into account. Second, actions and land uses should maintain or enhance ecological processes, functions, and feedbacks that affect plant community composition and responses to disturbances and sustain those fundamental ecological conditions and functions. Third, we need to maintain our key structural and functional groups, such as managing grazing to maintain plant communities and their riparian ecosystems, their structures and functions, and also things like using diverse seed mixes that are adapted to the site conditions. One of the things we're now starting to do is enhance climatically appropriate seed sources through the BLM Seeds for Success program in order to provide better sourced materials for use in seed mixes. Fourth, reduce the impact of existing stressors on our ecosystems. We need policies and plans in particular that protect habitat from fragmentation and protect the quality habitat that remains. Public land managers in particular may need to work with willing landowners to secure conservation easements in order to prevent conversion of that sagebrush habitat to other uses such as agriculture or residential development and to help maintain that connectivity. Fifth, promote landscape connectivity by reducing things like conifer expansion, suppressing wildfires under extreme conditions, and creating or enhancing the permeability of landscape to the movement of wildlife across it between the high-quality habitat patches. Lastly, we may need to create or maintain climate change refugia. Climate change refugia are those places on the landscape where the climate change will change, or the climate will change less or more slowly. And this may be the only places where some species are able to persist. Since the future is uncertain, we need to plan for multiple possibilities and look for responses that work for several of those possibilities. To aid in that planning, we should support collaborative research to obtain climate projections at the scales needed to inform management of the sagebrush biome and use the available geospatial data we already have to help determine which areas, resources, and actions should have priority over others. We need to ensure that the climate information provided by entities such as the climate science centers, the LCCs, and the climate hubs are actually reaching the people on the ground who need them. Public land managers may need to consider scenario planning with multiple stakeholders, not just within their offices. And of course, we always need to monitor, excuse me, we need to monitor and apply some of our adaptive management principles, share the information, learn from the outcomes. So we'll need specific strategies and actions for issues such as drought, changes in snowpack, fire, invasive species, insects and disease, and changes in species distributions. These are all discussed in the science framework, but we don't have time to discuss them all today, so we're just going to focus in on drought, wildfire, and changes in species distributions as examples. So drought, as this figure shows, has been recorded somewhere across the western U.S. since 2000. Note that in 2003 and 2012 and 13, nearly 80% of the western United States was in some level of drought. This is according to the Drought Monitor. And the type of drought we probably need to be thinking about more than just hydrologic drought or agricultural drought is what is known as ecological drought. This is the type of drought that's probably going to have the most impact in the sagebrush ecosystems, and it incorporates not only what's happening on the natural community side, but also what's happening on the human society and economy side. We've got to deal with both of those and look at the thresholds in both of those in order to develop strong adaptive responses. So for drought, there's several strategies to consider under drought. Drought management plans in particular can help prepare both public and private land managers for appropriate actions under drought conditions. Ideally, both the public and private land managers would develop integrated plans that cover both the base property and the allotment so that we can maintain land health conditions on both parcels. The drought plan should identify management actions that will reduce water stress on plants and those that promote the capture, storage, and safe release of water. Don't forget that floods can happen during droughts, and sometimes drought events end in a flood event. Another thing is maintaining our key structural and functional groups. We often have plans for what we're going to do out there as management actions. We may need to delay some of those actions until the probability of success is higher instead of adhering to a rigid schedule. And of course, as much as possible, reduce the impact of existing stressors, such as the impacts of grazing during drought. Even rangelands have now entered the era of megafires, as you may have heard elsewhere in this conference. To reduce the risk of more megafires, we need to alter our fuel loadings and arrangements in order to alter potential fire severity. One unintended consequences of our past aggressive fire suppression approach, in combination with the impacts of past grazing practices, is that we've homogenized our fuel beds. When you homogenize your fuel bed, you homogenize the potential fire severity. However, if we can maintain and enhance the competitiveness of our native perennial species and create fuel beds with greater spatial and temporal variability, then we reduce the chances that we're going to get unacceptable levels of fire severity. We also need to look for where to place fuel breaks in strategic locations to manage those fire risks. This is a conceptual model of the interaction between fuels and fire weather severity in rangelands. We have fuel type on the y-axis. Note that the sagebrush fuel load and the herbaceous fuel loads kind of go in opposite directions. And we have weather on the x-axis. Low fire weather severity is characterized by high fuel moistures, high relative humidity, low temperature, and low wind speeds. And of course, high fire severity is the opposite of that. So when our herbaceous fuel loads are high and our sagebrush loads are low, it's the herbaceous fuels that have the strongest influence on potential fire behavior and fire severity. When the sagebrush fuel loads are high and the herbaceous fuel loads are low, it's the sagebrush that's exerting the greater influence. And these are the relationships that are predominant when fire weather severity is low to moderate. Once fire weather severity starts moving into that high and extreme end, it's the weather that takes control, and the fuel arrangement matters much less. So another thing that we're already seeing is changes in the range of certain species. For the most part, the documented changes have been up in elevation and poleward in latitude. There have been some instances of species moving down in elevation, apparently in response to changes in precipitation regimes. In determining what actions are appropriate, we always need to keep in mind that plant species respond as individuals, not as communities. So as a result, we should expect to see new plant communities eventually emerge through the course of this century. Changes in either the amount or the seasonality of precipitation are just as important as changes in temperature when we think about climate change. So to illustrate, let's look at a couple of species. This is a result of a study that was done looking at big sagebrush within its current range. The cooler colors indicate lower risk of loss of climate suitability. Warmer colors indicate higher risk of loss of climate suitability. Other projections also indicate a general poleward shift in the range of big sagebrush over time, in other words, moving northward and up in elevation. But what may be even more important is that various models indicate larger losses of big sagebrush in the southern latitudes and at lower elevations than gains in the northern latitudes and at higher elevations, which means that over the course of this century, we may see the extent of sagebrush shrink. Climate suitability for cheatgrass is also likely to change with increases in temperature and changes in precipitation. Particularly changes in the amount of summer precipitation have some pretty big implications. Normally one of the reasons the western part of the sagebrush biome has such a cheatgrass problem is that it's a winter-dominant precipitation regime, whereas the eastern part is a summer-dominant precipitation regime. So in areas of the western part of the sagebrush that lose climate suitability, it's probably mostly due to increasing temperature. In the eastern part, it's going to be due to changes in the seasonality of temperature. Note that as we lose summer precipitation, the potential extent of sagebrush or cheatgrass increases in the eastern part of the biome. The blue colors in the western part indicate loss of suitability, but there's always something waiting in the wings to move in the place of cheatgrass. So unfortunately, we can't count on that for solving our problems. So many of the adaptive measures we can apply to address potential changes in species distributions are the same as those we're already using without necessarily considering climate change, or that I've already talked about in other contexts in this presentation. With invasive species, one of the things we need to be alert to is emerging invasions. For example, they may be a species that's already present but not invasive in part of its range. A big example of this is red brome. Highly invasive in the Mojave Desert. It's present in the northern Great Basin, but not considered invasive. However, as climate suitability for cheatgrass declines, it will probably increase for red brome. So we may see red brome replacing cheatgrass at the lower elevations in the western part of the biome. So some of the things we may need to think about are maintaining that connectivity and providing migration corridors. We may need to think about assisted migration for species that can't move fast enough for the rate of climate change. There's a lot of studies out there indicate that the rate of climate change is faster than the dispersal rate for some species. Think of like big sagebrush. What's its dispersal distance? It's meters. But it's going to actually need to be able to disperse on the scale of hundreds of meters, if not thousands of meters. So we may have to help move things like big sagebrush to areas or other types of species. And of course, as always, you'll hear this over and over again, is this reduction in the risk of invasive species introduction, establishment, and spread. One of the things we need to do to help with that is monitoring. Establishing permanent plots on the margins of species ranges is particularly helpful to see those movements starting to happen. So we need to plan for natural disturbances and consider them an expected occurrence, whereas our usual approach has been to consider them as surprises, and we only think about in our plans the kinds of disturbances that we deliberately introduce. We need to recognize these things are going to happen anyway. Even though earlier I mentioned using more climatically appropriate seed sources, we also need to hedge our bets and include some plant materials from sources a climate zone away or possibly further to think about what may be happening in the area of 20 to 30 years in the future. Many of our species are relatively long-lived, so we need to take that into account. We need to evaluate seed sources, or evaluating potential seed sources better adapted to the future climate can be done with the seed lot selection tool that was developed by the Forest Service. It was initially designed for trees, but if you know the source of your seed, you can put a marker in there and it will show you where the climate suitability is that most closely resembles that. So you can use it to evaluate how potential seed sources might work in your given area. And again, assisted migration in areas where we have high rates of climate change may be necessary. So to conclude, very rapid talk, excuse me, we need to understand what changes are occurring as a result of changing climate and develop viable strategies to address those changes in order to maintain habitat for desired species and to continue to support our desired land uses. The most frequent barriers to climate change adaptation identified by federal employees, and these often apply to the private sector as well, is lack of relevant information on climate change at both temporal and spatial scales relevant to field level decisions. Budget constraints, and in the case of the state and federal agencies, potentially lack of specific agency direction. Some of the basis for developing cost-effective and feasible management strategies requires that we support these research and management collaborative studies coupled with monitoring to understand what is going on in our landscapes and therefore what should we need to do. We also need to support continued research to provide those downscaled climate projections and interpretations at the scales that matter to managers. And again, scientists and managers working together can help develop working strategies and guidelines for what to do. We can't necessarily say, do this here, but we can say, here's the kinds of things you need to think about if this is your situation. In the case of state and federal agencies, we need guidance on how to think about climate change and the kinds of actions we should be thinking about taking. And with that, I got lots of time for questions. Rick?
Yeah, Louisa, you showed some of Ravi's work with trying to link climate change with cheatgrass is going to be doing species we don't have as much information on, but have you come across anything of trying to look at current climate conditions or projecting, like for Vietnam-Namibia?
The question was, have we got climate projections and what might happen with Ventonata. This is an emerging, very rapidly emerging invasive species in the northern Great Basin. Up in higher elevations, it seems to be responding to changes in temperature. At lower elevation, it seems to be moisture. At least that's my personal observations. There's not really enough known about Ventonata that I've been able to find to help us with that. But odds are it's sounding a little bit similar to cheatgrass, so we might be able to take advantage of some of the work that's done on cheatgrass to kind of understand some of the risks with Ventonata. Other questions? In the back?
The suitability of the sagebrush, thinking of climate, so you expect that in the current range it will get more pixelated. Sagebrush south slopes to the north, which is kind of forward to that problem, then you would have sagebrush topping in, but it still takes a little bit more. Do you expect that, or do you expect things to just deal with all the place, not move fast enough and break it all out?
The question is, will sagebrush become pixelated, if you will, basically get isolated into patches on the landscape, but the actual footprint wouldn't change? Or even if it moves northward, is it still going to wind up being more clumpy in distribution than it currently is now? You know, when you see those maps of the sagebrush biome, they show quite a large area where sagebrush is more or less continuous. Odds are we will see that clumpiness develop. Sagebrush is more likely to persist on the northerly aspects, sheltered drainages, higher elevations, so we may wind up looking a lot like the Sky Islands in some areas that they have in the southwest, where you have forests isolated on the tops of mountain peaks. That's possible that could happen with sagebrush, particularly in the southern part of the range, where conditions are changing, are getting so much more hotter. And it wouldn't surprise me if in the movement north, and this is a species where we're probably going to have to do assisted migration, that again, the same kind of thing will happen as it moves north. It's not spread very far into Canada from what I understand, but there's possibility that once you get into particularly eastern Canada or the central part of Canada, that's similar, basically an extension of our plains, it might be a little more continuous in a setting like that. But in like British Columbia or Alberta, which is more mountainous, again, it'll probably wind up being distributed onto the cooler, moister sites. Another question?
So as we see these changes, activity changes coming in hotter and drier, do you see a fit for using non-natives as a potential tool to keep the grainland in perennial function? What's over there toward that?
Okay, the question was, as things be warm and dry, do we see a greater potential for a greater increase of use of non-native species in order to preserve those ecological functions? I think that's a very real possibility. When we talk about the ecosystem processes and functions, we're probably thinking more about plant functional groups instead of specific species, so deep-rooted perennial grasses. And if none of our native deep-rooted perennial grasses can survive any longer on a site, we may be bringing in deep-rooted perennial grasses from somewhere else in order to preserve that function. But only time will tell.
Another one. As vegetation dries up, potential dries up, in the part of the world where you're familiar with, southern Oregon, you have two competing crops, well, not competing, there's two sampling crops happening. There's Iroquois moss and fire. And the moss is complete. And it's not standing. In the Great Basin, we don't have moss, except in the north, really, where there's no sand. So as things dry up, I would expect the moss to not be, because it depends on this kind of May, June, July, warm, wet temperature that happens at 15 and stuff like that. The moss will start not being a factor, perhaps anymore. And what you would predict out of just say transition law is that you would have density, increased canopy cover, so this kind of open step country that you see in southern Idaho, just that will start closing up. You'll have canopy. Do you expect stuff like that? That the moss is really special because it has a profound effect. If you look at rate every 15 years, that's a profound effect on opening the structures, canopy cover. So is this something people are thinking about competing with a lot of subsidies or canopies closing up and changing fire behavior?
Okay, the question was about aroga moth and how it might affect sagebrush dynamics in the future, given that it's primarily, well, where it seems to be a factor in sagebrush community structure is in the northern Great Basin, Snake River Plains. That's where we've had the big outbreaks, although the really big outbreaks seem to be occurring on about every 30-year basis on 2 data points. We don't know a lot about aroga moth. There has been a little bit of study that's been done, that indicates that things like growing degree days are important for moths, and also precipitation during, I think it's the 4th instar, if I remember correctly. So how climate change is going to affect that isn't well known. That's another area. Insects and disease are an area where we need a lot more study. We just don't know that much about the insects and diseases that are important in these systems. As near as I could tell, I don't think we really have a good handle on what may happen in terms of a roga moth and how it may influence sagebrush dynamics in the future.